Welcome to the module on the first aorist active and middle indicative. What you have before you is part of a master verb chart. This verb chart will get larger as you go through the course. And so far, we've covered the following past time tenses. We have the imperfect tense. We covered the second aorist tense. And for this module, we'll be covering the first aorist active and middle indicative. For the imperfects, recall that the way we form it is we take the augment, we take the lexical stem, and then we add to it the connecting vowel plus the secondary active suffixes, which is nu and sigma, nothing, men, te, and nu again. And then we do this, and that's both for the active and middle passive forms. For the second aorist, we only learned the active and middle forms. We haven't learned the passive yet, so no passive. And it's formed almost the exact same way as the imperfect, except when we add the augment not to the lexical stem, but to the verbal root. So note that a balon with a double lambda in the imperfect means I was throwing, but a balon with a single lambda, this is the verbal root, means I threw. This week we're going to learn the first aorist active and middle forms. These are by far the more common, more frequently used form for the tenses. And when we look at the first aorist, what we'll notice is that it forms the aorist tense in a way that's very different from the second aorist tense. So you take the verbal root. For luo, the verbal root and the lexical stem are one and the same. You add to it an augment. What you'll learn is we'll learn something called the tense formative sa, and we'll still use the secondary active suffixes, but these will be slightly modified for the first aorist tense. Let's look at the first aorist tense now up close. The first aorist active indicative for a paradigmatic verb luo is formed as follows. You take the augment, you take the verbal root, you take the tense formative sa. It uses no connecting vowels, and it uses a modified version of the secondary active suffixes. So I shaded where the modifications come in. They come in the first person singular form and the third person singular form, and the rest of the paradigm is what we would expect for the secondary active suffixes. So let's look at how we can say I loosed. Remember that if I wanted to say I was loosing, it would be luon. And that's how I would form the tense for the imperfect. But this is I loosed, not I was loosing. And here we would take the augment epsilon, add to it the verbal root, lu. We take the tense formative sa, that's a sigma and alpha, and there's no connecting vowel because the tense formative already provides a vowel, the alpha. So you don't need to add a connecting vowel. And instead of adding a nu, as we would expect for the imperfect, we're adding nothing to it, and so this is the form. So elusa, that's how I would say I loosed. For the second person singular form, I take the augment, I add the verbal root, I take the tense formative, and then I add the sigma to it, and which is what we would expect for the second person singular suffix. So elusas is you loosed. How do I say he, she, it loosed? Take the augment, take the verbal root, add to it a modified form of the third person singular suffix, which is sigma, and here instead of an alpha, we actually do use a connecting vowel, the epsilon, and then we have a movable nu. So eluse or lucen are both ways to say he, she, it loosed. And then for the plural forms, the first person plural, second person plural, and third person plural forms, it's going to use the secondary suffixes as we would expect with no modification. So to say we loosed, you take the augment, you take the verbal root or the stem for the aorist tense, you add the tense formative sa. This tense formative tells you that is an aorist tense, hence the word tense formative. So this sa is the clue to recognizing the first aorist tense. And so you add to that men, which is the first person plural secondary active suffix, and elusamen. Elusamen is how we say we loosed. Elusate is how we say you all loosed. And elusan is how we say they loosed. Now notice that in the first aorist, because of the modifications, the first person singular and third person plural are distinct and different forms, and there's no way to confuse the two. And so with having filled out the paradigm, let's recite it all together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusate, elusan. So how do we form the first aorist middle indicative, which I've translated intensively as I myself loosed, you yourself loosed, she herself or he himself loosed, etc. Remember that while this is the form for the middle, we will not learn the aorist passive form until a future module. So we're not going to learn the aorist passive until later. This is just for the middle form. And the way we form the first aorist middle indicative is we take the augment, add to it again the verbal root or the stem that we would expect for the aorist form, the tense formative sa, and then the secondary middle passive suffixes main, sa, ta, meta, sitte, ninta. Now, like in other tenses, even though sa is technically the suffix for the second person singular, we're not going to see it because that sigma is going to drop out and we're going to see some vowel changes. But let's go over the first person singular first. How do I say I, myself loose, the middle tense, where the subject I is being emphasized rather than the verb? I take the augment, I add to it lu, which is our verbal root, the tense formative sa, and then I add main to it. So elusa main is I myself loosed. How do I say you yourself loosed? Well, I would add the augment, the stem, aorist stem, or the verbal root, the sa tense formative, and I would add sa to it. But because the sigma doesn't like being sandwiched between two vowels, we should expect that sigma to drop. And then we follow the big 5 rules. What happens when an alpha and omicron combine? They contract to an omega. And so this is the big 5 rule. So when we see the final form, therefore would be elu, not elusaso. We would not expect elusaso, but instead we would expect eluso, where the sigma has dropped and the alpha and omicron combine to give you that omega. And that's you yourself loosed. How about the third person singular? He or she or it itself loosed. Take the augment, add lu, take the sa tense formative and add ta to it, and it's elusata. How about we ourselves loose? First person plural. The augment, the aorist stem, tense formative sa, and metha. So elusametha is we ourselves loose. The second person plural is the augment, the stem, elusate, that's you yourself loose. And for the third person plural, the augment, the stem, the tense formative, and then nunta, which is your third person plural suffix ending, and you have elusanta. So let's say the first aorist middle indicative forms all together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Elusamen, eluso, elusato, elusamata, elusate, elusanta. Let's say that again. Elusamen, eluso, elusata, elusamata, elusate, elusanta.